Pressing play on this episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at my favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm your host, Tom Browning. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to the 10th episode of The Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. I'm your host, Tom Browning. I just wanted to take a moment and introduce the player that I'll be profiling today, and that is New York's very own number 22, Nick Fotiu. Nicky Fotiu played for the Rangers back in the mid to late 70s and early to mid 80s with a stint along the way with the Hartford Whalers. He also played with the Philadelphia Flyers, Calgary Flames, and Edmonton Oilers toward the latter end of his career prior to retiring. But Nick Fotiu is a very interesting story as it pertains to his National Hockey League career and his stint as a New York Ranger. Nick Fotiu is probably going to go down, if not the most popular player in New York Rangers history. He will definitely be in the top 3 to 5 players who ever wore the red, white, and blue. The thing that sets New York's Nicky Fotiu apart with the Rangers is the fact that he grew up as a New York Ranger fan. He grew up in Staten Island, sat in the blue seats as a youngster watching the New York Rangers play. He dedicated himself and was not shy about conveying his sentiments to his buddies that he grew up with in Staten Island that one day he is going to play for the New York Rangers. Whether that fell on deaf ears with his buddies or whether they thought that there was no way that Nick Fotiu, a native New Yorker, could ever play in the National Hockey League, that did not deter Nick Fotiu one bit. As a matter of fact, Nicky Fotiu started his career, skating that is, at the age of 15 years old. So he was almost a full-grown youngster when he started lacing up the skates and commuting, taking 2 subways and 2 buses from Staten Island, New York in the middle of the night to get ice time at the ice skating rink in New Hyde Park, Long Island. And Nick Fotiu dedicated himself in every way, shape, and fashion that he could to being the very best hockey player he could be in his goal, his quest to become a New York Ranger and a National Hockey League player. Now, Nick has a very interesting and very entertaining background. And because of that, I'm going to break up this podcast into little vignettes, little stories of stuff former players talked about regarding Nick Fotiu, people that knew Nicky off the ice, sports writers. So I'm going to be providing these little strokes of information regarding Fotiu over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I hope you'll find these to be very informative and very entertaining and kind of give you a good feel as to what Nicky Fotiu was all about. So let's drill down a little bit as it relates to how Nick got his start. As I mentioned before, Nick Fotiu was tough as nails. He was boxing in the New York Golden Gloves. He was tough in his determination and his fortitude and discipline when it came to preparing himself to play in the National Hockey League starting at the age of 15. But this gives you a better feel for just how tough as nails, in quotes, Nick Fotiu really was. And this comes from an article in the GreatestHockeyLegends.com. And back in New York, and as a kid growing up on Long Island, I could relate to this in that whenever my buddies and I would play hockey, we would oftentimes have to rent out the Copeg Arena, the Comac Arena, the Kings Park Arena, literally in the middle of the night, because that was the only time that kids could get affordable ice time, whether it be skating at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And this is what Nick Fotiu had to do, but he had to travel 3.5 hours each and every day. And I'm quoting Nick Fotiu, and he would say, sometimes I'd find myself on the subway in the middle of the night, and I'd say to myself, am I nuts or what? Is this all worth it? I'd be up at 3 o'clock in the morning and getting home at 9 a.m. because it was often easier to get ice time between 5 in the morning and 7 in the morning. So just when people were first getting up and getting ready for work, I would be coming home from the rink, dropping off my gear, and going to work myself. And Nick Fotiu had to take 2 buses, 2 subways to get from Staten Island to the rink in New Hyde Park, Long Island, which also happened to be where the New York Rangers used to practice back in the 1970s. And this is something that really epitomized and really underscored just how dedicated Nick Fotiu was. Now remember, this is a young teenager, probably around 15, 16, 17 years old, and taking the tough New York City subways in the middle of the night. So that was one aspect that really separated Nick Fotiu from other kids who had similar dreams of playing in the National Hockey League, maybe even New York kids who had dreams of playing in the National Hockey League, but a kid who really made it happen. Roger Bear recalls when Nick Fotiu used to help out at the New Hyde Park Arena when the Rangers were practicing as a teenager. I guess this must have been after Nick was finished with his own practice. And he would oftentimes help out as a stick boy, I guess, or just help the players out with their equipment or with their sticks. And he would tell Roger Bear, one day, mark my words, I'm going to be playing for the New York Rangers. And Roger Bear would more or less dismiss a young Nick Fotiu by saying, yeah, sure, kid, one day you're going to be good enough to play for the New York Rangers. And, well, the rest is history. So let's talk about another aspect of Nick Fotiu's background that he was very good at, and that is boxing. It's very well known that Nick Fotiu, from a very young age, was a tremendous boxer. As a matter of fact, that was one of the career paths that people in the field of boxing thought that Nick could be very successful at. He had tremendous boxing skills. He had tremendous strength. And his boxing skills led him to a boxing championship within the Police Athletic League, New York Golden Gloves Boxing, where he had a lot of matches at Madison Square Garden. And if you ever watched Nick Fotiu play ice hockey, whether it be when he was in the North American Hockey League, the East Coast Hockey League, playing for the Cape Cod Cubs, whether it was in junior hockey, playing for the New York Arrows in the New York Metropolitan Junior Hockey League, or in the National Hockey League with the New York Rangers, Philadelphia Flyers, Calgary Flames, or Edmonton Oilers, he went into his boxing stance whenever he fought. It wasn't the typical clutch and grab boxing, the in-close boxing that most pugilists in the National Hockey League grew up on. Nick would actually go in and prepare to box in his boxing pose, if you will, and he would actually try to outbox his opponent on the ice. And that's what made him one of the most feared fighters in the National Hockey League, is that you had the best fighters in the league knowing that Nick Fotiu was professionally trained. He was a professionally trained boxer. And Dave Schultz mentions in his book that he was not afraid to fight anybody. He says, I didn't always win, but I had absolutely no fear to box anybody except for one guy, and that is Nick Fotiu, because Nick knew how to box. Nick was professionally trained on how to box. So Nick had a reputation, not only outside of the rink, but inside of the rink, as being one heck of a boxer. And that distinguished him from some of the other heavyweights in the National Hockey League, in that this guy could actually box. So that's another interesting story that really strengthens the reputation of Nick Fotiu as one of the most feared players when he played in the National Hockey League. So let's talk about Nick Fotiu's professional hockey career. As I mentioned before, he played amateur junior hockey with the New Hyde Park Arrows, the New York Metropolitan Hockey League. But when I first got exposure to the reputation of Nick Fotiu was actually watching the Long Island Cougars play hockey. Now, the Long Island Cougars they were the minor league hockey team for the WHA's Chicago Cougars. That was in the 1973-74, 74-75 seasons. They played in the Comac Arena, and they replaced the defunct Long Island Ducks. When the New York Islanders came to the National Hockey League in 1972, the Long Island Ducks, in essence, basically went out of business. But there was an arena, a very nice arena in Comac, Long Island, where the Ducks played their home games, and the Chicago Cougars were looking for a minor league affiliate at the time. So John Brophy, a former coach and player for the Long Island Ducks, became the head coach of the Long Island Cougars, again, the minor league affiliate of the Chicago Cougars of the WHA. And I don't know where I remember this story, and I hope it's true. I think it's true because I heard it, I believe, on more than one occasion, and I can't remember who I heard it from, but I believe there was a game where the Long Island Cougars played up in Cape Cod. Now, Nick Fotiu, in his first year with the Cape Cod Cubs, actually led the North Atlantic Coast Hockey League in penalty minutes. I believe he had over 370 minutes in penalties. And I believe there was a brawl at the Cape Cod Arena where the Cape Cod Cubs played, and I believe it was against the Long Island Cougs. And Nick Fotiu had already been ejected from the game. And the fight was still getting out of hand and still going full force on the ice. And something precipitated that made it necessary for Nick to come out of the locker room in his long johns and hockey skates out on the ice to pick up where he left off defending his teammates with the Cape Cod Cubs. So I would love, if I had the chance to speak to Nick Fotiu one time, I would love to see if this was just a rumor, or if this was something that was actually true, or if it was just a figment of somebody's imagination. But I've heard it more than one time, so I hope it's true, because it's a funny story, it's exciting, and it just goes to show you the type of teammate Nick Fotiu was. He was always willing to protect his teammates. And then after 2 years with the Cape Cod Cubs, and then joining the Hartford team of the WHA, the Rangers signed him in 1976. And just to go over some recollection, I just remember Nick Fotiu being one of the fastest skaters on the New York Rangers. Whenever he came out on the ice, when the Rangers would take the ice before every game, it was like he was shot out of a cannon. He ran onto the ice with those skates. Now, he was a big guy. Nick Fotiu was about 6'2", about 220 pounds, 215, 220, all muscle, solid as a rock. And he had great speed. Now, Ron Greshner would always joke that going north to south, Nick Fotiu could have been the fastest player on the Rangers. It's just that he didn't turn very well. He had trouble making cuts and turns. But when he went full speed ahead, north-south, he probably was the fastest New York Ranger on the club the 8 years that he played on the New York Rangers, or at least a good portion of those 8 years that he played with the Rangers. And I remember Nick Fotiu coming in on breakaways, coming in with a full head of steam, and he was very tough to defend. And another thing that Nick Fotiu had, he had a heck of a wrist shot. He had one of the hardest wrist shots on the Rangers and one of the hardest wrist shots in the National Hockey League. There was many a time that he scored goals just on the sheer force and velocity of that wrist shot alone. And, there were 2 seasons, back-to-back seasons, where Nick Fotiu scored 8 goals for the New York Rangers. So he wasn't just an enforcer. As a matter of fact, Nick does not think of himself as an enforcer. He really thought of himself as a complete hockey player, because he was given a normal shift many of the years that he played for the Rangers. Now, there were some seasons where he was relegated to part-time duty, where he was a healthy scratch, because maybe the team the Rangers played against, they were not particularly physical. But against the physical clubs, Nick was always in there. And he was given a pretty healthy dose of shifts on the ice. And he could check. He was a punishing body checker. I remember a game against, I think it was Vancouver or maybe it was Minnesota, against Kevin McCarthy, where he laid out Kevin McCarthy at center ice on a humongous check right at center ice. He caught an unsuspecting McCarthy on a solid, clean body check. And I'm sure that hurt for quite a few days after that check. But Nick was a complete hockey player. A very good skater. He had the wrist shot, scored some goals, but he was always there to defend his teammates. And as far as his fighting ability, he was one of the best in the game. I remember some of the doozies he used to have against Ben Wilson of the Philadelphia Flyers, Glenn Cochran of the Philadelphia Flyers. There was very few opponents that really wanted to tussle with Nick Fotiu because, as I mentioned earlier, because of his boxing ability. But he did not win them all. But he won the vast majority of the fights the players he went up against. He had some doozies against Paul Holmgren, the Philadelphia Flyers. They had, if you want to go on YouTube, you can see a lot of Nick Fotiu's old fights as a member of the New York Rangers, as a member of the Flyers, and as a member of the Calgary Flames as well. So Nick was a great fighter, but he was a great teammate. And one of the things that Ranger fans really appreciated was his willingness to throw pucks up into the stands. I remember having season tickets in the early 80s up in the blue seats, where Nick really got his indoctrination to New York Rangers hockey. He was a former blue seater himself, and after every warm-up, he would get the pucks, and he had a great arm. Nick Fotiu was probably a hell of a baseball player because he would be able to reach the rafters, the blue seats, throwing the pucks up in the blue seats after every warm-up before every game. And that was just one of the few things that really endeared Nick Fotiu to the New York Ranger fans. Also, his ability to defend his teammates. When the Rangers needed energy, when the Rangers were in a funk, when the Rangers just could not get it going, it was Nick Fotiu. When he went on the ice, he would bring instant energy to the New York Rangers with a solid body check, with a goal that no one could have foreseen when he would be charging down the ice, going 100 miles an hour, beating the goaltender, or being a very intimidating forechecker. The New York Ranger fans really loved him, and they really appreciated his community service as well. So Nick Fotiu was a player that will live on as one of the most fan-friendly and popular players in New York Rangers history. So, in wrapping up the last vignette, if you will, regarding Nick Fotiu, this is something that's fairly recent. And I remember reading about this a couple of years ago. And when I did some more research for the podcast, it came back to life in reading it again. He discusses when the New York Rangers lost to the Tampa Bay Lightning a few years ago in the playoffs. And that series, I believe it was the Eastern Conference, might have been the Eastern Conference Finals, but they lost Tampa Bay Lightning in 7 games. And that playoff was famous for the Rangers not showing up at home during that series. They showed an incredible lack of energy and ability to make anything happen at home, at least 2 of those games during the series against Tampa Bay, that Tampa Bay ultimately won in 7 games. And in particular, that Game 7 at Madison Square Garden, the Rangers were shut out 2-0, and Nick Fotiu was interviewed, and he was just beside himself at the lack of willingness for the Rangers to get dirty during that series. Dirty in the fact that they wouldn't try to screen the goalie. They wouldn't get their hands dirty trying to get rebounds. He had mentioned that, Rick Nash has scored 42 goals during the regular season that year, but only 5 in the playoffs. And, he would keep on hearing, as we all did, how Rick, though, was playing good defensive hockey. But Rick was playing good defensive hockey. Yeah, he's not scoring, but he's playing good defensive hockey. But Nick Fotiu felt the same way that we did. He's not paid to play defensive hockey. He's paid to score goals. And he made a point of saying that Rick Nash had no marks on his face. He didn't get his hands dirty. He didn't create traffic in front of the net, which you have to do in the playoffs to score dirty goals. And Nick went on to say that you don't have to fight to intimidate during the playoffs. You just have to check hard. You have to be rugged. You have to attack the front of the net. You got to really want it bad enough. And he had also mentioned about Chris Kreider. He had mentioned something to Chris Kreider about being willing to teach him how to box during the offseason. And Chris Kreider said, yeah, I think I'll take you up on that, but Chris Kreider never showed up. And I think that Nick Fotiu sees a guy like Chris Kreider with the skill set he has, with the physical tools that he has, and if he could become an intimidating player, whether it be learning how to be a better fighter or learning to use his body down in the dirty areas more than he is right now, just how more successful the New York Rangers hockey team can be. And that's Nick Fotiu. He has not forgotten where he came from. He is still as big a fan today of the New York Rangers as he ever was. And oftentimes you don't see that with professional hockey players. When they're finished playing hockey with the teams that they played with, oftentimes they don't pay attention to what that team is doing, currently. They have lost really their affiliation with the team. But not Nick Fotiu. He's still a Ranger fan. He's a Ranger alum. He's a Ranger fan, and he would love nothing better than to see the Rangers lift that Stanley Cup. So that's the podcast on Nick Fotiu, left wing Nick Fotiu, number 22, the great native New Yorker who played for the New York Rangers, one of the most popular New York Rangers to ever lace them up for the red, white, and blue. Once again, number 22, Nick Fotiu. Thank you for listening. This has been a Go Tommy Boy production.